Good morning, Kim Hammer, pastor Saline Missionary Baptist Church down in Tull, Arkansas, with your devotion this morning. And it's taken from the book of Genesis, chapter 47, over into chapter 48. We find now that Joseph has his entire family settled down with him in Egypt. They've inherited from Pharaoh the best land in the nation of Egypt in order to be able to raise their flocks and raise their family. There's about 70 of them that came, and so they are settled in, and now Joseph has to turn his attention back to dealing with the crisis at hand, and that is the famine, because at this point they're only about 2 to 3 years into the famine, and so the food supply is not dwindling. He, through God's wisdom and saving up for 7 years of plenty, had enough to go around to feed the entire nation of Israel as well as neighboring nations, which brought all those neighboring nations up to Egypt. There is a life principle in this, if you would, and that is that there's never a bad time to save up for difficult times. And so that's what they had been doing, and that's what Joseph had been put in place of under Pharaoh to take care of the people of Egypt, and yet God knew also that that would be a means that he would take care of his people. And as we mentioned before, the structure was best set up in Egypt because was the leader. One leader ruled the whole nation. It wasn't fragmented or compartmentalized like it was in other parts of the world, smaller groups. It was a nation big enough to do it. God was using Pharaoh, and Pharaoh didn't even know God was using him, even though he respected God because what he'd seen in Joseph and how he had acted toward him under his leadership. People have had all their money bought up by this time. That happened in the first 2 years of the famine. The people had exhausted all their money. They cashed in all their CDs, as we would say today. They sold all their stocks. They sold all their gold. Anything wasn't nailed down, they had sold. They'd emptied their jars. They checked their accounts. They were flat broke and had no money at all. And so, for having to buy food before the Pharaoh. So Pharaoh now had all the money in the land. And then secondly, what began to happen was that people came to Joseph and said, you know, what good are livestock to us? We can't feed them, so we will give them to you. And so for a year, people came and sold their livestock to the Pharaoh, and he took the livestock in. So now he had all their money, he had all their livestock. Well, then the next year came along, and the people were still hungry because the famine was still so severe in the land. And we find that now the people were willing to give their land and to sell themselves into bondage and to become slaves to Pharaoh in order to get the food. Pharaoh definitely had the upper hand here, and it was because of Joseph that he did. But all this time, God was growing his nation. This is the benefit, the side you need to look at. All during this time, because Jacob, Israel, had brought his sons, the entire Israel nation, the 12 tribes, if you would, up to Egypt, and they had found favor with Pharaoh. God was growing the nation within the nation of Egypt. And so while the Pharaoh probably felt he had a pretty good deal because he had all the money, he had all the land, he had all the livestock, he had the people working for him as slaves, he felt he had it pretty good. He just didn't realize how big it was that the nation of Israel was growing, and he, through the resources that had been saved up, was sparing Israel's life and helping them grow. Now, when Israel gets ready to leave, and it's kind of futuristic down the road, but because of the system that was set up during the plague, or during the famine, and you remember when Israel gets ready to leave hundreds of years later, they didn't leave poor. They left with a lot of stuff. And it was because it was in the hands of Pharaoh and the people that they were able to leave, and they had the financial resources to go back to their homeland and be able to start not as a poor and destitute people, but as a people who had had another nation take care of them for years, and they had the resources to go with them. Now, the Egyptians were happy. Hey, we don't have to worry about nothing. We are on welfare. We do the work, and he takes care of everything. The only thing they had to do was they had to give a fifth of their crop when they grew it back to Pharaoh. And that would take care of his household, and the other 4/5 were left to them to have seed to grow the next time around for the next season, but also food to eat. But they didn't have to worry about their land. They didn't have to worry about taxes. They didn't have to worry about, what happens if a cow dies. It wasn't theirs. None of it was theirs. They were just living in a state of poverty, I guess you might say, because it would depend on how much that they could grow as to how much they got to keep. Then we go on and we find that Jacob now begins to realize that he's about to die. He's been in Egypt 17 years, so he has outlasted the plague, or outlasted the famine. He's 147 years old by this time, and he's about to die. And he takes Jacob and he makes him swear an oath to him that he would take him back to his home cemetery, to his home plot, in order to bury him along with all of his other people. And once Joseph makes that commitment to him, the Bible makes a really interesting statement that Jacob leans on his staff and he worships. And you just kind of have to use your visual imagination a little bit here. Here's a guy that's got 147 years under his belt. He's seen so much. He's been forced to leave his homeland. He's come to Egypt, and yet God has provided for him and has blessed him just as much there as if he stayed in his homeland. So it doesn't really matter where you are. God's blessing can cover you anywhere you go if he chooses to give it to you, because you have earned the right to be blessed by God. But here is Jacob, Israel, leaning on his walking cane, and he's worshiping God as he looks out over the land, and he reflects back over 147 years of life. 147 years of living. Not always easy living either. I mean, you think, we went through that list a couple of days ago, you think of everything that he had to deal with in life over 147 years, but yet he could still worship God. That's the way I want to be. If I lived to be 147, I got my right mind, my capability to stand up and lean on a walking stick, I hope I have the attitude that I want to worship God too, because no matter how bad things happen in life, there's always something to worship God for.